There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
The voyage of the Beagle has been by far the most important event in my life and has determined my whole career.
If you recall, in the last episode we left Charles standing at the foot of the path that would lead him into his future, or in this case, the foot of the gangplank. Charles, at 22, had never sailed before, so he didn't quite know what to expect of either the voyage or the ship's captain. The captain was Robert Fitzroy, and this was to be the young man's second voyage out on the HMS Beagle. I say young because the captain himself was only 26 years old. He had the distinction during his first voyage of capturing 5 natives who had attempted to steal one of the ship's boats. This little group of natives consisted of 2 men, 2 boys, and a girl. One of the men eventually got away, so Fitzroy was left with 4. Not quite sure what to do with them now that he had them, he decided to do what any captain worth his salt would do in possession of 4 natives who had no idea what was going on. He kept them. If you've ever seen My Fair Lady or its earlier incarnation, Pygmalion, you may have an idea what Fitzroy decided to do with them now that he had them.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
He gave them odd-sounding names, such as Boat Memory, Button, and Basket, and he tried to civilize them. He brought them back to England, and the experiment ultimately failed miserably. One of the natives died after being given the smallpox vaccine, and the other 3 eventually returned to their native soil and back to their old ways. Fitzroy is said to have had a hot temper, and he was prone to bouts of depression which would afflict him for the remainder of his life. It would eventually, unfortunately, cause him to slit his own throat at the age of 59. But all of that is still years away. At this moment, we are only concerned with the period of his life between the years of 1831 and 1836, otherwise known as the Second Voyage of the Beagle. It was a voyage to remember, and one which would change the world. But first, Fitzroy had to meet the young naturalist with whom he was to share his quarters with. As far as impressions go, Fitzroy wasn't quite impressed.
On becoming very intimate with Fitzroy, I heard that I had run a very narrow risk of being rejected on account of the shape of my nose.
Fitzroy was a phrenologist, and phrenologists felt that a man's character and disposition could be gathered by a careful examination of their facial features and the shape of their heads, bumps and all. Fitzroy, it seems, was a nose man. Needless to say, Darwin must have convinced the young captain that his nose wouldn't get in the way of his duties or his abilities to serve as a right companion to the captain, and Fitzroy eventually acquiesced. Darwin stood on the deck to bid England farewell. The date was December 27th, 1831, 2 days after Christmas, and shortly after setting sail, young Charles impressed the captain even further by suffering chronic seasickness. It was one reason that Charles spent as long as he did on shore whenever they would stop. He was in no rush to reacquaint himself with his sickness. And during the various stops in South America, Charles would travel by horseback and marvel at the tropical forests and the wildlife within them. He had a good eye for specimens such as bugs, birds, and shells, and he took as many opportunities as possible to collect them. Some he kept with him on the ship to study, and others he would send back to England to wait for him when he returned. Now, one of the fossils he found and sent back was a jawbone of a mylodon, an extinct species of giant sloth. As one can imagine, this collection of fossils, fauna, birds, and bugs must have taken up quite a bit of space, it was another thing for Fitzroy to go on about. Lest one think that the two didn't get along, though. Let me set the record straight. They did. There was a mutual respect for one another, and they did the best they could in such close quarters with long bouts at sea and long bouts of Charles being sick. And in 1835, the Beagle reached the Galapagos Islands and spent 5 weeks there. There are 16 islands which make up the small chain, and Darwin managed to set foot on at least 4 of them. And during a conversation with the island's governor, the governor claimed that he could identify a tortoise and which island it came from simply by the shape, color, and design of its shell. It was insights such as this that began to feed the flames of an idea that had started to form in Charles' mind, a marvelous and dangerous idea. He began to notice things that he hadn't quite noticed before. Mockingbirds were plentiful on the islands, and each island had its own type, and each type of mockingbird was slightly different. Some beaks were larger, while others were smaller. Their diets were also different depending on the island they resided on. So Darwin did what any young adept naturalist would do. He collected specimens, and he filled his notebooks.
During some part of the day, I wrote my journal and took much pains in describing carefully and vividly all that I had seen. And this was good practice. My journal served also, in part, as letters to my home, and portions were sent to England whenever there was an opportunity.
On October 2nd, 1836, the Beagle docked in Falmouth, England. The 5-year voyage was over, and Darwin and Fitzroy parted ways as friends. Fitzroy would go on to become the second governor of New Zealand, and Darwin would go on to, well, we'll get to that shortly. One thing that Darwin hadn't expected was the fact that, thanks in no small part to the specimens he had been sending ahead of him, he had become somewhat of a celebrity among his fellow naturalists. In total, he had forwarded 1,529 species that were forever preserved in bottled alcohol, as well as 3,907 specimens that were dried. It's of interest to note that his gift of specimens continues to this very day. Shortly before the recording of this episode, actually last month in August of 2014, the University of Copenhagen's Natural History Museum found a unique treasure in its possession that it had no idea it even possessed. 77 different species of barnacles, collected and categorized by Darwin himself. These he had gifted to Japetus Steenstrup. Japetus was a Danish zoologist and then director of the Royal Museum of Natural History. And here we are 150 years later, and they are just now being exhibited. So getting back to Darwin's return to England, now that he was home, Darwin began the exhaustive and extensive study of all that he had found and all that he had seen. New notebooks were being filled and placed alongside those that he had crammed full of ideas while on the Beagle. If at the time you were to have pulled one of his notebooks off the shelf and flipped to page 36, you just might see a curious sketch. You might at first mistake it to be a tree, but on closer examination you would see that this tree was special. There are no leaves on this tree, only branches. And what these branches are doing are telling a story. Just what this story is could be anyone's guess, unless, of course, you were the sketch's author, and you might think that even he isn't quite sure what the sketch is, given that above it are the words, "I think." If you were a student of René Descartes, you might imagine that the author of these words simply forgot to finish the phrase off with, "Therefore I am." But in reality, it would be, "Therefore we are." Page 36 of Notebook B marks the first appearance of Darwin's Tree of Life. Upon poring through his notes about turtles, birds, and barnacles, an idea had begun to take shape. The governor of Galapagos could tell the tortoises apart because each island allowed for the tortoises of that particular island to enjoy slight changes which were not passed on to the tortoises of other islands. The reason being that these tortoises can't swim. So, while the tortoises of one island might display shells with a slightly raised hood to allow their host to nibble at leaves above eye level, another set of tortoises on another island might not have the same feature because the vegetation, or at least the kind they like to eat, never grow much or never gets much higher than a few inches off the ground. And what if, Darwin's thoughts began to lead him, what if all these tortoises had one common ancestor whose offspring were somehow scattered amongst the different islands? Without the ability to find or to get to one another again, to breed with one another again, the different environments they were in would in time force them to change. Darwin knew this was possible. Hadn't man been doing the same thing for hundreds of years to dogs and plants? By careful selection and breeding methods, man could turn a wolf into a chihuahua and a cabbage into broccoli.
How selection could be applied to organisms living in a state of nature remained for some time a mystery to me.
It was all well and good to say that man could help to select for a more gentle dog with shorter hair, or even a larger stalk of corn. It was a different thing altogether to see how nature could do the same thing. Now this troubled Darwin for some time, until one day, hoping to calm his mind for a spell, he sat down to read a book in his library that he had beforehand been neglecting. One can imagine his eyes growing wider as he read.
In October 1838, that is, 15 months after I had begun my systematic enquiry, I happened to read for amusement Malthus on Population, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on, from long-continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favourable variations would tend to be preserved, and unfavourable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species.
In the span of one afternoon, the seed that had been planted, perhaps as far back as his grandfather's zoonomia, that seed began to sprout, and the world would never be the same. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and you can find show notes and source material and also ways to support the show at evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to hear from you as well. I hope you're having a great week, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.